Well, hello there. This is Shane from Shane's Books and Review, and I hope you are having a great day today. We're going to be discussing 1984, wrote by George Orwell. What a book. It was interesting. And 1984 follows our anti-hero Winston Smith. Now, Winston, he is in charge of writing and rewriting histories so that the people will always think that the government is correct. Oversimplification, but really, that's what he does. And Winston starts having these personal dilemmas. They live in a society that is really strange compared to our own, but not too far of a stretch either. Now, I am not a conspiracy nut. Never have been, never will be, but I can see how this kind of a thing would really frighten people. So essentially, their world history is that countries have turned into just 3 countries for the entire world, and oddly enough, each one of those has enough resources that they really don't need each other. They don't need to fight, they don't need to do anything. But there's this strange thing that's happened, and they all kind of understand it, the leaders at the top of these 3 mega countries. That is that if they don't continue the fight, then there's no reason. Without the reason, the people won't be behind them. Without the people behind them, they won't be able to continue doing what they do. Eventually. So, the little wars that they fight really is just over trading routes, and that's it. If they need to get something from point A to point B, Oceania fighting this one or this one, they fight this one instead. And that's where Winston comes in, because he's the one that makes that happen. He goes back and rewrites the history so that they haven't been just fighting this mega country for the last 4 or 5 years. No, indeed, it's always been this one instead. These are the ones that we're supposed to really be disliking. Now, not only is there that going on, but if you happen to find a slip of paper with anything wrote down on it, you're supposed to throw it in these memory holes where things get incinerated sometimes they're kept. And there's these plaques on the wall / screens that are always playing government type propaganda. You can only turn it down so far whenever it comes to its brightness or audio, but they can always see you, so you don't know if they're watching or not. Now, not only do we have all this going on, but there's also a complete ideology of if you do anything that has to do for your person and you enjoy it, then you have committed a crime. So there's this really weird and unique concept in the book of personal freedoms are indeed crimes against the state. And if you think a particular way, then you're against your country. And this is where the thought police come in. The thought police are a wide-ranging group of people that are thought of as men in black suits of mythicalities. These guys and gals, they come in and arrest people and then reprogram them and or execute them. So it's not a very friendly place to live if you're not in the top echelons. If you were to decide instead of going to work, oops, I'm an enemy of the state. Or if you happen to come across something of value, such as actual coffee, then that would be a mistake. Things have gotten so tightly drummed that there's only a few types of liquor and alcohol, and pretty much anything that goes against what they say should be the norm is an enemy of the state. So it's, if you're not with me, you're against me, and everything's against me. And that's the idea of the country that they live in, and hence the problems that it's causing for the people. Let's talk about Winston for a little bit. Winston is having a huge personal dilemma. Throughout the book, he ends up meeting this girl / woman, and I'm going to say girl-woman from this point forward because it's accurate in this sense. It feeds into the male ego so very well the way that it was wrote. George's books do this from time to time. She was an absolute beautiful girl-woman that could have been a model. And he described himself as being this yucky scarred thing, and why would she even want to be with me? But they end up having a bunch of little trollops through the forest, and eventually a friend or acquaintance that owns a pawn shop, they end up setting it up so that towards the end of their relationships that they're able to stay there. Voila, there we go. She works for a different part of the ministry that is a different ministry altogether, which is actually responsible for telling people sex is bad and okay. You should not be having sex, you should only love your country. And in fact, that was one of the things their specific country wanted to do, was to actually get rid of sex altogether and just use science to procreate their people. Now, the two of them, they start realizing that they could actually buck the system a little bit. They could start getting things off kilter. And if enough people tried this, then they'd be fighting the good fight, and maybe they could get out of such strict controls. And eventually things go sideways, because where they thought they were joining a revolution, nope, instead they were actually tripped by the ministries. Then we move into the next part of the book. The next part of the book is kind of a rough one for me, I was really kind of horrified by some of the stuff that was in here, and it has to do with that mystery of love, which is completely responsible for reprogramming people, brainwashing them. Our friend here, Winston, our anti-hero, he thought he was fighting the good fight. He thought he was going to help bring around revolution and get people freed. He knew from his own personal memories that this is not the way that things are, and maybe it's not the way it's always been. There might be a better way to live, and that's the same thing that his woman girlfriend thought. Unfortunately, like I said, they got caught, they got trapped. The book that was supposed to be this big foundry revolutionary thing was actually wrote by the individual that was torturing Winston until Winston was able to forget logic and accept that 2 + 2 is 5. They beat Winston senseless until he can accept and not even see the problem of dichotomy in the statement of 2 + 2 is 5. Because you see, there's this thing called doublespeek. And doublespeek, which they want to eventually make into a new language so they can better control the individuals from expressing any kind of dissonance, self-thought, or creative ideas. Yes, that you can say everything without saying anything, or you can say this and mean this. And they wanted to get rid of all the descriptive words so that good was good, bad was ungood, etc. That was the section I actually had the most issue with, and it was because it was just plain out boring. I did not enjoy reading through all that. But that's okay, because it served a means and it served a purpose, and without that section, other parts of the book might not have come together for me so well. Now back to our buddy Winston. While he's being tortured and reprogrammed, he starts to live this dichotomous life inside of his own mind space where he knows that this is what they're doing and he's trying to give them the right answers, but eventually they do break him. There's one thing he was priding himself on, and an agreement he had made with his woman girl that they would not betray each other. However, the grand torturer takes him to the dreaded room. There's one room where it has everybody's worst fear. It really takes a lot of getting to know someone to be able to pull something like this off. But essentially, Winston was going to have his head put into a cage with 2 rats, and then those rats were going to eat his face off, and he eventually does betray his love. When he does, he breaks emotionally and mentally completely down the rest of the way, and the rest of the book follows him in his stupor, reprogrammed, brainwashed state, where instead of realizing that these things are wrong and we shouldn't actually just go with it, he now does. He works for a ministry that does nothing, and they get together and do nothing. They're supposed to be discussing how a comma should fall into a paragraph. Is that ridiculous? Well, we're going to go past all that, and we're going to say this. Whenever it comes to George Orwell, he doesn't always write a happy ending, and I like that, because sometimes there's not a happy ending. Sometimes life wins. Sometimes having just that as an acceptance of life wins doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative outcome. It's more of a realistic outcome. Even if you're just one person, if you're fighting an entire country, you're not going to win. The whole point of the book is to get people to think about the personal freedoms that we have, what life would be like without. George Orwell, he wasn't necessarily a strict communist writer. He wasn't a socialist writer, and he wasn't a democracy writer. He, in fact, would take a look at all these things, and since he lived in an area where he could see all of them, he knew the rise and the fall, the pitfalls, and the good pieces of each different type of political system that he would write about. And he would highlight the bad and the good about everything freely. For that, I respect his writings. It's valid points, everything he had to say. And so the better question that arises from the book is, what happens whenever we finally relinquish all of our personal freedoms to things like Facebook, etc., and we're left with a world quite like that? That's the possibilities. Now, this really wasn't a book that was designed to talk about Facebook and personal freedoms in the digital era. That just wasn't something that was on his mind. However, that is the correlation that fits into Fahrenheit 451. To that discussion of 451, whenever it came to giving up personal freedoms, there it is. And with that, I'm going to leave you pondering it. Think about it. See what kind of correlations that you can draw between those 2 books and current society. That's the reason why I feel like this book, 1984, is still relevant today, because it does address those issues, and it should be an eye-opener for anybody that reads it. Not that it was a book that was wrote about actual factual things, but the concepts that are within it aren't that far off. The end of the book, let's talk about that. So the end of the book was kind of a unique eye catcher for me, and after I read it, I made my first recording of this video that I probably lost. I noticed that it was not wrote in this doublespeek that was throughout the entire book. That was neat, and here's why that was neat. It was wrote in standard English, and it was wrote in a way that was historical and in common English, which makes me think that at some point the government stopped controlling the year because they wanted to stay 1984, because if everything is comfortable and static, then there's less chance of people realizing that something is going on. And so all this doublespeek crap went away. Now, before you ask, how would scientists and other people work in a place in a society where such a watered down language would be the norm? Well, they had their own descriptive things that would fit into each and every category of each and every little science thing and or mechanical thing, etc., that would allow only the person working on that particular thing to be able to figure out what was going on. Hence my major issues with it, because language in general is such an important thing. We think in the language that we know best, and I just couldn't imagine a world where my language would be so limiting. But language is such an important thing to us as people and as a society, because that is what allows us to express the things around us. It goes beyond just those simple descriptions. What about in science and in math? Without those types of descriptive words that we can really hone in on what we're talking about, how can we progress? And this is actually addressed in the book as well, because there's mention of that in places that are kind of in the fringes, technology and things have progressed, but usually in an anti-establishment only or anti-controlling only way, because that's what's needed the most. So in the end, it looks like good sense and logic did prevail in 1984, and that kind of was the win, where poor Winston certainly did lose in the end. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Today's book was 1984, wrote by George Orwell. Like, share, subscribe. Don't forget we have a Patreon now. I'm going to post it here on the screen and in the description down below. Thank you for hanging out and spending your time with me today. Appreciate that. This is Shane from Shane's Books and Review, and I will see you on Monday. You have a great weekend.